it ended up being so successful, they moved nearly 17,000 people in those 3 months, and they only had the locomotive, 2 coaches, and an old caboose.
Years ago, Dynamo Productions was just a dream. 15 years ago, it was just a YouTube channel. 15 years ago, it was one kid with no idea what was coming. 11 years ago, you supported us on a wild adventure into the unknown and trusted a group of inexperienced cinematographers to deliver on a dream. The adventures that have followed since have taken our team all over the US, introduced us to new friends, new parts of the community, expanded our group, given us an expanded appreciation for not only the history we all covet, but the community we are all part of. But why here? Why a shortline railroad in upstate New York that was seemingly forgotten by everyone, even the railfan and steam preservation communities at large, except for those local? Why did we choose to hold our first event here, and why are we back 11 years later? This is the story of the Arcade Attica Railroad, a gem hidden in the farm fields of upstate New York, a shortline railroad that truly captured and embodies the spirit of the early days of tourist railroading.
My name is Pat Connors, and I've been involved with the ANA Railroad since 1991. I'm currently their secretary and one of the full-time employees that gets to work on the steam locomotive. I got my start because my family was from the Arcade area, and I hung out at the end of the street and got to see the engine. I spent my summer vacations watching the steam train pull excursions back and forth. The railroad was formed, it became a big part of the village of Arcade. The question becomes, why is it even here? You're out in the middle of absolutely nowhere in New York State. The history goes way back to the beginning. You got to think about the Erie Canal that went across the northern part of the New York State, and all the towns that had the canal all of a sudden became very prosperous. So all the southern tier communities went, well, what about us? And the canal quickly proved that it had an economic value, but it had shortfalls. If you didn't have rain or the winter came, the traffic could slow down or stop. So the railroad quickly took over and everybody got railroad fever. So this particular line originated from the north end, Attica, New York, and what they were aiming for, they were looking for supply raw materials, to the lumber, the hardwoods, so that they could grow like all those cities along the Erie Canal. And the first trials, they were aiming south for western Pennsylvania to hit the coal fields, so they had a supply of energy. There were a lot of trials and tribulations over the years. Several companies made an attempt. It started as a 3-foot narrow gauge that actually connected the Erie Railroad both at Attica and Cuba, New York. And ultimately, most of those smaller lines failed. The local people along the line, which in 1917 when the ANA was formed, were mainly farm-type farmers and agricultural, and they were looking for a market to get their product to the cities. And they were the early subscribers. The promoters of the railroad went door to door in this valley to make sure that rail service stayed. And even today, a lot of the families are related to the original stockholders from 1917. But it was really a farm road to get product in and out. A lot of railroads went point to point. You had a city or a community that needed service, say like Pittsburgh, that was going to be steel. You needed raw supplies in, you made something, you shipped it out, and they would connect big city to big city, lots of commerce. When you look at a place like Arcade, New York, this was always a trunk line. This was the end of nowhere, so it would be tough to have that kind of point to point. And that's one thing that's unique about the A&A, since it's always been a short line or a trunk line. It's never been owned or operated by the big railroads. It was never profitable to have a lot of through trains, a lot of passenger traffic. It was always to nowhere. So when you look at the right-of-way, it's not graded like a CSX today is. It's the rail's smaller, everything's used, but they've always found a way to find that need. So now the railroad's formed, and it starts out as agricultural. It's fresh vegetables off the line. Milk was a huge product that came out of here. In 1900, every town had a creamery or some way to deal with the fresh milk. The faster you could get it to somebody's table, the better the milk was for everybody. And the cities were growing to such a degree that they were huge consumers. So this line actually was a feeder. All the fresh milk would be loaded every morning onto a train, could go to Attica, could be in Buffalo or New York City same day off of this line. So it gave a purpose to the farmers, and that grew into transportation of milk. You got to keep it cold. So what happened was, along a lot of these towns, they originally had their own creamery. When the railroad came, now you can move the milk farther. So what became the Borden's company set up bigger creameries where they could chill the milk. The pasteurization process came along, and then powderization. Once they powderized milk, you could store it for long periods of time. And now the country grew because all of a sudden you got a food source that, all products, you could move it from a little place like Arcade, New York in the middle of nowhere, but supply every city, not just Buffalo or Rochester or New York City that were near us. The people that are into railroad histories notice that the A&A dieselized very early, and that brings the question as to why they might do that. I mentioned that they were never associated with a large railroad, so they never had massive amounts of capital for improvement, but the one thing they became very good at was to become frugal and efficient with everything they had. And in 1940, when they began looking at a diesel locomotive, most major railroads were still buying steam locomotives. So the A&A had a unique problem. Since they didn't have that big revenue, they didn't have the large customer, they had to see what they could do to survive. And this newfangled diesel all of a sudden became, hey, we need less labor. You don't have to have a shop crew that's keeping the locomotive hot all the time. You could turn it on when you need it, shut it down and go home. It was unknown in 1941. And the General Electric Company came up with a small size engine that was perfect for a branch line like this with its light rail, and the A&A took a chance. It was 100% about survival. And then once that first diesel made its trip to Attica, and they figured that they could cut the crew, cut the labor, fuel cost They didn't have to maintain coal piles, get rid of ashes. It really proved that it was economical, and the ANA never looked back. By 1947, they bought their second diesel, and the last steamer was retired off the line, and they were fully dieselized. So almost one of the first in the United States to be 100% dieselized. The other thing that became apparent as they lost more and more customers, now World War II has ended. Traffic was dwindling countrywide because now you've got the coming of the highway system, the coming of the automobile, larger trucks. All of a sudden there was a lot of competition for the railroad. And we'll go back to the beginning of the ANA. It was heavily agriculture, and people relied on rail because it was the major source of transportation in 1900. By after World War II, all of a sudden you had your own personal freedom. The 15 miles that the ANA operated didn't generate a lot of passenger traffic, and the directors through all those years, they tried and tried and tried to make the railroad successful, and they were always great at reinventing or finding a way to survive the dieselization. So now comes along 1962, and the north end of the line's washed out, the railroad has been cut in half, freight is on the decline, and they got the bright idea that, hey, there's a lot of nostalgia behind steam locomotives. Unfortunately, we cut up our last one in 1947. So they actually went countrywide, started looking for a locomotive, and found old number 18 in Upper Michigan off the Boyne City Railroad. And they decided that they were going to try their hand at running steam excursions. And it was another gamble. They really didn't know that it was going to be successful. The locomotive arrived in May of 1962. They got the first runs in August. They ran through the fall. It ended up being so successful, they moved nearly 17,000 people in those 3 months. It was one of the pioneering tourist railroads in the country, really. Today, now almost 60 years later, we're one of the oldest still surviving under its original structure. As it grew, of course, we added more coaches to the mix. We ended up with a total, from the beginning, we had 8 different Lackawanna Boonton type coaches. 2 of them have been scrapped since now, but we still operate 6. But as we grew, we needed those more coaches, and they thought a need for a second locomotive, because if you're going to run one every day, it's nice to have 2 so that you can rotate the maintenance. And so they continued to search, and they found another locomotive. It was number 14, built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. That one was found on the Escanaba and Lake Superior. And when they found that one, that railroad had kept it as a ready standby, and they were using it in the wintertime to melt switches. And so it was ready to operate when the ANA found it. So they bought the second one, and for a long, probably 10 years worth of excursions, they would rotate back and forth. And the Baldwin really has classic lines. When you look at that locomotive, it is a short line engine, but it's got a lot of lines of beauty. It was made to pull a passenger train. And really, I think the fans over the years really sought out to see that Baldwin. Now, 18 is unique in itself. To me, it is way more of a freight locomotive. It was meant to be dirty and working a yard back and forth shunting. It's done most of our excursions since 1962, but a little uniqueness in both engines. So the locomotive itself was built in 1920, so that makes it more than 100 years old now, which is kind of unique. To run any piece of equipment that long takes a lot of time and effort. When they built these locomotives, they were built for a life cycle. They would run 1 million miles. They would go through a big shop for a class overhaul. The 2 locomotives that the ANA purchased were actually from other short lines who probably were similar to the ANA in the fact that they didn't have those large shops, those large forces of people. What happened after World War II, when all U.S. railroads began dieselizing, you also lost all these major steam shops. Even the manufacturers of the steam locomotives closed their doors because they either dieselized or there wasn't a need to take care of these. So we've lost a lot of knowledge and a lot of manpower, but the locomotive still needs that same kind of work. On a regular basis, it gets a 30-day washout of the boiler to make sure that the water isn't attacking the boiler. General cleaning, every pin and bushing on the locomotive needs work. The more you run it, the more you have to fix it. So typically, as I said, engines were done on a life cycle. Well, since the time that 18 was built, it's never gone through a class overhaul where its boiler was replaced or every piece on it was repaired. We've gotten 60 excellent years of running on it, but time has takes its toll, and it needed repair. What happened after World War II, well, let me back up. Because now we're in the United States, we only have a handful of steam locomotives that operate under their own steam. The federal government, who mandates all railroad operations, said we should take a look at all the tourist operations that are running locomotives. This happened in the 1990s, and they said we should look at the steam code since it hadn't been modified since World War II when everybody used a steam engine. Maybe we should look and see if there's modern practices that people are doing to keep these safe. So they actually rewrote the steam code, and they changed it so that every locomotive has to be inspected at 15-year intervals. And this is actually the second time that we've gone through this with 18. And while doing that, what we're doing is we're looking at the original condition of the engine and its current condition to see how worn it is. And that goes from the boiler, thickness of every sheet, every stable, every flue, right down to every pin and bushing. And since they rewrote all that code, there's a lot of things that we can do today that we couldn't do before, like welding on the boiler. Remember when these were built, they were all hand riveted, built by hand, formed by hand. So when we went through this process, it took us 7 years to complete it, but we literally stripped the engine down to its bare bones frame, and this is the only time in the history of this locomotive where the boiler was actually pulled off of the frame. We sent the boiler to Fulton, New York, to Mack Brothers, a private boiler firm that was capable of doing that kind of hand riveting and work on that boiler. And then the frame was actually sent out to Indiana, to the Grambling Locomotive Works. Through contract work, they actually redid all of the suspension gear, the pistons, the side rods. It's seen more work in the last 7 years than it probably saw its whole life. So it really is almost like a new locomotive. And we did this to ensure that we get another solid 50 years out of that locomotive. If you take care of it and run it, clearly it lasted 100 years up till now, and it's our duty to make sure that it can last that way again. So there's pretty much no part on it that hasn't been touched.
My name is Patrick Connors, Jr., and my position here is conductor and a little bit of fireman on the passenger excursion trains. So the Arcade Attica Railroad, it's always held a very special place in my heart, and as far as getting into railroading, this place really was a huge step in me starting to get into railroading. Mainly it goes back to almost 3 generations of my family. I had a great-great-grandfather that worked for the Buffalo Attica and Arcade. It skipped a few generations to my father that also worked at the Arcade and Attica, and now myself working here. But just along those lines, on my father's side of the family, there's been many generations of Connors to live and work here in Arcade, especially with the railroad. So I think on that note, being able to continue working for the railroad has been something that has just meant the world to me to carry on that tradition. My favorite part of working at the Arcade and Attica, there's really a lot of different things. It's hard to narrow it down to just one. I really enjoy being on the passenger train for a multitude of reasons. I think the biggest one is getting to meet the 35,000 plus riders that we bring in each year. Everybody has a different story, but the one thing that almost every rider in common has on this railroad is that they came here when they were a little kid, either with their parents or their grandparents, and then they come back here today either with their kids or their grandkids to ride the train. And getting to hear that story, it just makes the job even that much better, being able to be part of a generational thing like that.
My name is Christopher Kovacs. I was born and raised in Buffalo, New York for the first 12 years of my life. And the Arcade in Attica was the first steam-powered railroad I ever saw as a kid, about 1994, 1995. The last time I was here was in 2001 during a summer camp trip. And I was probably the only one out of the group that was excited to ride the train. Everybody else thought it was boring. I was having a ball. I remember vaguely about 1994-95, the first time I rode the railroad, being in the open-air gondola on the way back from Couriers and just watching and listening to number 18 stomp its way back up the hill going back to Arcade. That's probably the best memory I have of that railroad at that time. It's real nice to come home to what I would consider my hometown railroad, being in Buffalo. It's always nice to come back home, and it just gives me a feeling that hardly little has changed since I've been here, but these guys have made a lot of great strides for the better. The track work's gotten better. 18's probably in the best shape it's ever been, and they're doing a great job. Being the only steam tourist railroad in New York State is a high honor to have, and I hope these guys can continue it for as long as possible.
I have a lot of high hopes for the railroad, especially 18. As I mentioned, the business has been growing, especially in the freight side, but as well as the passenger side. I would hope one day here in Arcade that we could have 2 operating steam locomotives, and we could not only become the only railroad in New York State to regularly operate steam power, but turn into a steam capital for the Northeast here. I really think with the dedicated people that we have working here and the patrons that come out to ride the train, that's definitely something we could do. And as far as the freight's concerned, Breisdorf has been moving a lot of cars here these past few years, so much so that we've actually pretty much built a whole yard right in North Java, and I have high hopes that that's going to continue. And hopefully one day, both sides of this business will be busy enough. You'll see trains running 7 days a week here, and you might even see some powered by steam.
The future looks very good for the railroad, and we absolutely hope that people come out and enjoy. We like to say it's a slice out of time. Everybody's got their cell phone, everybody's in a hurry. You can go onto Google and have instant gratification on everything. We're a little bit slower. We want you to come and see how life used to be and go enjoy a touch of the past so that you can connect. And all the work that's happened here, we have a lot of volunteer hours that went into the engine, but most of it was paid for by funds through ticket sales. Everything that we do here is based on you and every person that buys a ticket. It's 100% done on people that visit us. So if you don't ride the train, then we can't run the locomotive. So we're happy to provide that history, and I do think that there's a lot of growth here. We've got another locomotive that can be restored, and we've got a lot of opportunities to expand our tours business.